If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I will share a surprise story that I have prepared especially for you. Your support is really valuable for the continuation of these stories. The New Mexico Territory, 1883. Dry, cracked earth stretched for miles without shade. The sun had climbed past its peak, and the heat pressed down like weight. There was no wind, just the stillness of a place people had long given up on. The mining settlement wasn't much anymore, just a scatter of collapsed cabins, a burned-out church, and one saloon that barely stayed open. Locals came to drink and leave. Law was flexible here, survival wasn't. When something went wrong, someone paid. That was the only rule. At the far edge of town, just beyond where wagon tracks faded into brush, a wooden pole had been staked upright in the dirt. No ceremony, no platform. Rusted manacles clung to the top, and from them, a young woman hung. Her arms stretched overhead, fingers swollen, wrists bloody from metal biting skin. Her name was Aaliyah May Colburn, 23 years old, daughter of a man once accused of arson and murder during a borderland feud. She hadn't been involved back then. She'd been 15, working on a neighbor's ranch to keep her family afloat. But her father's name had stuck to her like tar. Nobody had ever forgotten it. That name had been enough. This time, someone's horse had gone missing. A bay mare. Someone claimed they saw her near the stables the night before. No trial. No questions. The sheriff, more a drunk with a badge than a real lawman, decided the evidence didn't matter. She was cuffed, dragged, and chained to the post. They left her there 2 days ago. No food. One mouthful of water the first night. No one had come since. Now, her lips were cracked. Her skin had started to blister. Her legs had buckled hours ago, leaving her body sagging, all her weight suspended by her wrists. She couldn't lift her head anymore. Her thoughts blurred and looped. Where is the sun in the sky? Is this the day it ends? Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. She stopped counting how many times she thought she'd die. The only thing that kept her from letting go entirely was the sheer refusal to let them win. Then hooves. She heard it first, one horse steady. No wagon team. Not the sheriff. Not townfolk. She forced herself to raise her head. The figure came out of the shimmered heat. Long coat, wide hat, riding slow, no dust kicked up. He didn't stop until he reached the base of the pole. He dismounted with the kind of deliberate movement that said he wasn't here to ask permission from anyone. His name was Silas Cade, about 34, tall, lean from hunger and years on the trail. No known birthplace. No surviving family. Some said he'd fought in the war. Others said he'd killed a man in Montana and hadn't stopped moving since. What was true didn't matter. He never confirmed or denied it. He just kept riding. He didn't come for her. Not exactly. He passed through town that morning, just to water his horse. He'd heard the barkeep mention Colburn's girl strung up out by the dead ridge. He hadn't planned to stop, but he had. Something in him refused to ride past it. He stood in front of her now, silent, watching. Aaliyah blinked hard, forcing her eyes to focus. The world swam. "Please," she rasped, but it barely came out. He stepped forward and reached behind him. The knife he drew wasn't polished or decorated. It was a work tool. He grabbed the manacles at the base, checked the lock, then slid the blade under the chain link. The metal resisted. He braced his foot against the pole and twisted hard. The chain snapped. Aaliyah collapsed instantly. He caught her before she hit face first, one hand bracing her under the shoulder, the other gripping her forearm. She winced at the touch. Her wrists screamed with pain. Her knees hit the dirt anyway. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. Silas pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. He uncorked it and offered it to her mouth. Her lips twitched, somewhere between suspicion and desperation. She took a sip, then a second, then a third, slow and trembling. It ran down her chin. She didn't care. He crouched beside her, watching, calculating. She wasn't just dehydrated, she was half dead. But her eyes stayed sharp, and that meant something. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Aaliyah," she whispered. "May Colburn." He stared at her a moment longer. She waited for judgment, the flinch, the insult, the question that always came. It didn't. "How about no place to be tonight?" he said flatly. She nodded. It was the closest thing to a pact they'd ever make. He helped her to her feet. It took time. Her legs weren't working right. She leaned against him, shoulders trembling. She hated the weakness, but she needed him, and she knew it. He mounted her on the horse. She swayed. He adjusted the blanket behind her back so she wouldn't fall. They rode in silence. He didn't ask what really happened. She didn't explain. As the town disappeared behind them, neither looked back. That night, he made a fire beside a dry wash. She sat wrapped in his bedroll, hunched over, coughing dry and sharp. He handed her a dented can of beans and a spoon. She took it, ate with slow, careful bites. Didn't ask whose it was. He sat across from her, sharpening the knife he'd used on the manacles. Not looking at her, not avoiding her either. She watched him. His hands were steady. His eyes never flinched from what they were doing. No rings, no scars he hadn't earned. "Why'd you stop?" she asked, voice hoarse. He didn't answer right away. Then, didn't seem right. "Nothing here ever is," she said, staring into the fire. He nodded once, and that was the end of the talking. They were strangers. No trust, no plan. But when the fire died down and she drifted into uneasy sleep, he sat awake, eyes scanning the dark, hand near his revolver. Not for her, but for anything that might come looking. He didn't know what he'd do with her. He didn't know where they were going. But he knew one thing. He made a choice. And for now, he was staying. By morning, the desert had cooled just enough to keep the flies off their skin, but the relief didn't last. The sun was already climbing when Aaliyah opened her eyes. Her limbs ached from the position she'd slept in, curled awkwardly beneath the blanket, skin still sticky from dried sweat and blood. She shifted slightly and winced. Her wrists throbbed. The pressure cuffs had left behind swelling and angry red lines. Her throat felt raw. Her head foggy. She glanced toward the man who'd untied her from the pole. Silas sat a few feet away on a flat rock, chewing slowly on a strip of jerky. He didn't offer a greeting. He just looked at her once to see if she was still breathing, then turned his eyes back to the dry stretch of nothing beyond the fire pit. His horse stood nearby, reins tied to a mesquite branch, tail swatting lazily at the air. Aaliyah pulled the blanket tighter, not out of modesty, but control. She still didn't know what he wanted. Nobody did anything in this territory without expecting something back. "You gonna ask what I did?" she asked after a while. Her voice was rough, but it held steady. He tore off another bite, chewed, then swallowed. "Don't care." She watched him. No sarcasm, no twist in his tone, just plain truth. It made her more unsettled than if he'd spat an accusation. "I didn't take the horse," she said anyway. "I know," he replied, eyes still on the horizon. She hesitated. "Ow!" He finally turned toward her. "If you had, you wouldn't have been sitting in the middle of a town too small to lie in." That shut her up for a moment. It was the first thing anyone had said in her defense since the cuffs went on. "Name like Colburn," Silas added. "That's all they need." She looked down at the dirt, picked up a twig, and dragged a shallow line across the dust. "You know the name?" He nodded once. "Your old man worked land near Las Cruces. Got blamed for burning a storehouse. Some people died. He vanished. No trial." She narrowed her eyes. "You were there." "I was passing through." Silas didn't elaborate. He didn't offer sympathy either, and that, somehow, made it more honest. Aaliyah leaned against a nearby log, exhaling slowly. Her whole body felt brittle. The silence stretched again. Only the sound of the fire dying out and the creak of saddle leather in the breeze kept the space from turning too still. "What about you?" she finally asked. "Where are you headed?" He reached for his canteen, took a drink, then stood. "Nowhere." She watched him tie the roll and strap it behind the saddle. No insignia, no brand marks on his gear. No town name carved into his rifle. It struck her then, this man had scrubbed away anything that tied him to anything. Even his boots looked like they'd walked away from a past too heavy to carry. "Then why stop?" she asked again, quieter now. Silas paused. "Didn't like the way they walked past you like you weren't there." She looked down again. Her voice dropped. "They saw me. Didn't see a person," he replied. "Just a name, a charge, and someone they could forget by breakfast." She didn't know what to say to that. He crouched to put out the last embers of the fire, burying them under dry soil. You can stay here if you want. I'm moving west. She blinked. That's it. He nodded. Ain't offering you anything but distance from them. She studied his face. No smile, no trick. Just that quiet certainty. It didn't sound like pity. It sounded like fact. You always this generous with strangers? No, he said, but you weren't going to last another night. Aaliyah pushed herself up, slowly, groaning at the weight in her legs. She stood, barely, then caught herself on the log again. Her jaw tightened. I'll come, she said. He gave her one short nod, then turned and started saddling the horse. Before they left, she cut 2 strips from the bottom of her dress and tied them around her wrists. She didn't say it, but the feeling of the cloth, clean, even if rough, was a reminder that she wasn't property anymore. Not theirs, not his. They rode out at a slow pace. She sat behind him in the saddle, stiff at first, holding onto the saddle horn. Not him. Every bump sent fire through her ribs, but she didn't complain. Around noon, they stopped near a dried-up creek. Silas handed her another can of food. She ate slowly, methodically. He kept watch. She glanced at him several times, trying to read his silence. He said little, but his eyes scanned the hills like a man who'd been hunted once before. After they ate, he took a moment to check his revolver, cleaned the chamber, reloaded. Aaliyah watched, noting how his hands moved, efficient, controlled. No flourish, no drama. You're not running from anything? She asked. I didn't say that. She nodded, didn't push further. By nightfall, they'd covered maybe 10 miles. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but it felt farther from the town than she'd ever managed to get on her own. That night, as the fire cracked and the cold settled in, Aaliyah asked him a final question. What do you want? He stirred the fire with a stick, watching the embers shift. I want to get to a place where nobody remembers me, he said simply. She watched the flames for a long time. Me too. And that was the first real thing they shared. They didn't know what the coming days would bring. But for the first time in years, Aaliyah felt like she had a say in where she woke up next. And Silas, he didn't admit it out loud, but he no longer rode alone. Not truly. The third day on the trail was colder. A wind had picked up during the night, blowing from the north, dry and bitter. Aaliyah pulled the blanket tighter across her shoulders, sitting cross-legged near the low fire Silas had managed to keep alive until dawn. Her skin stung where sunburn had begun to peel, and the stiffness in her arms and legs hadn't eased since they left the edge of town. But she was upright. She was moving, and that meant something. Silas sat across from her, checking the stitching on the saddlebag. He hadn't said much since morning, but that wasn't unusual. It gave Aaliyah time to think about the things she hadn't said, about questions she hadn't asked. Why was she really still following this man? What exactly did he see when he looked at her? They broke camp with practiced quiet. She helped him pack the gear this time, slow but steady. Her hand still hurt, but she didn't ask for help. She refused to be pitted. As they rode west, the terrain changed. Fewer rocks, smoother sand. Shrubs gave way to stretches of dry grass. A river used to run through here. Now it was a cracked, shallow trench winding south. Silas led the horse without speaking, and Aaliyah sat behind him, fingers loose on the back of the saddle. After an hour, she asked, You ever been out this way before? He gave a faint nod. Years ago. Nothing much past the ridge. Few abandoned homesteads. Railroad passed it up. Is that where we're going? He didn't answer right away. I don't go to places. I go through them. That settled into her gut like a stone. No destination. Just movement. Still, she stayed on the horse. Around midday, they stopped at a dry well with an old stone base and a sun-faded bucket, cracked and useless. Silas checked it anyway, lowering the bucket with a rope he carried in his pack. It scraped bottom fast. Bone dry. Aaliyah sat on a flat rock and watched him. You ever think about settling down? She asked, not sure why the words came out. He turned, expression unreadable. Can't build a house when you keep looking over your shoulder. She bit her lip. You done something that bad? He didn't flinch. Bad enough. She waited, but that was all she got. Silas refilled both their canteens with the last of his water supply. We'll find a spring tomorrow if we cut north. Aaliyah nodded and stood. Her legs didn't shake as much now. She was adjusting, body catching up to survival. but her mind still circled unanswered questions. There was one she hadn't voiced, the most obvious one. "Silas," she said carefully, as they walked back to the horse. "Why didn't you leave me back there?" He stopped, one hand on the saddle. She continued, "Not just the chains. I mean after that. You didn't owe me anything. You don't even know me." He looked at her, jaw tight. His eyes weren't angry, just tired. "Because I've seen people left behind. Ain't never been right since." She studied him. "And you?" He stepped up into the saddle, hand out to help her up. "I've been both," he said quietly. "Left behind and the one that did the leaving." She didn't ask which haunted him more. That night, they set camp near a cluster of broken fence posts. Might have once been a cattle range, but nothing remained except dry boards and rusted wire. Aaliyah cooked for the first time, beans and hard biscuit from his saddlebag. She didn't ask permission. They ate under the open sky, silence settling over them again. But before they turned in, Aaliyah said, "You never asked what I was doing that night." He looked over the fire. "Didn't need to. I was feeding the mare," she said. "She wasn't mine, but the stable boy didn't show up, and the thing hadn't had water all day. I unhitched her, led her to the trough, and someone saw me just as the horse walked behind the fence line." He nodded slowly, but didn't interrupt. "I didn't speak up when they blamed me," she added. "Didn't think it would matter. They knew the name." Silas shifted slightly, eyes steady. "You were right." She stared into the flames. "But it still eats at me that I stayed quiet." "You weren't wrong," he said. "You just weren't heard." They sat with that truth for a long time. Later that night, she woke from a half-dream, panicked, breath tight in her chest. Not because of the nightmare, but because for the first time in years, she hadn't had one. Her eyes scanned the camp. Silas was sitting upright, leaning back against his saddle, rifle resting across his lap. "You sleep at all?" she whispered. He glanced toward her. "Not much." She lay back down. "You always watch over people like this?" "No," he said. "Only when I think they're not done yet." And this time, she believed him. She closed her eyes and didn't wake until dawn. The wind came in stronger the next day, carrying dust from the open plains and stinging their faces by mid-morning. They rode north now, as Silas had promised, following faint signs of an old cattle route. Wagon wheel grooves long since worn down still cut shallow into the earth, barely visible under scattered dry grass. Aaliyah pulled the blanket tight across her shoulders and leaned slightly forward in the saddle, her body still sore but adjusting. Her lips were cracked again. The last sip of water from her canteen had been stretched since sunrise. She glanced sideways at Silas, who had been silent for most of the morning. "Why north?" she finally asked, her voice low. "Spring, I know," he answered without looking at her. "Used to be a trading spot before the rail passed it by. Haven't been there in years, but if it's not dried out, we'll have water by sundown." Aaliyah nodded, then hesitated. "And after that?" she asked. Silas's jaw tensed slightly. "Depends. We can follow the dry creek east. Might hit the edge of the Lakota camps if they haven't moved on. Or we keep riding. You get to pick." It was the first time he'd said anything about her having a choice. They didn't speak for a while after that. By mid-afternoon, they found the spring. It wasn't much, just a small depression where the ground sloped down and a pool had formed beneath a cluster of cottonwoods. The water was clear and still. Silas crouched beside it and filled both canteens in silence, then let the horse drink long and deep. Aaliyah washed her face and wrists, blinking as the sting faded from her eyes. She drank slowly, letting the cool water settle into her stomach. When she stood and looked around, she saw something half buried in the soil beneath the trees, a weathered wooden post with markings carved in a language she didn't recognize. It wasn't English. It looked like Lakota script. Silas followed her gaze. "Used to be a peace point," he said. "Traders and scouts used to meet here. Wasn't always peaceful, but it held longer than most places." Aaliyah bent down and brushed the dust from the carving. "You were here back then?" Silas nodded once. "Before the war." She turned to look at him, brow furrowed. "Which war?" He didn't answer. That silence, heavy and familiar, made her realize something. She didn't know where he came from. She didn't even know if Silas Cade was his real name. She'd accepted it without question, but now she felt the pull to understand more. You ever have a family? She asked cautiously. Silas stood and wiped his hands on his coat. Once. Long time ago. What happened? He gave her a long look, then finally said, They didn't make it through a winter. Fever came through the mountain towns. Took most of them. I was away at the time. I came back too late. Aaliyah didn't know what to say. She thought of the silence he carried, how it sat in his shoulders like weight. She wondered if it wasn't guilt he carried, but the ache of having no one left to talk to. I'm sorry, she said finally. Silas crouched again near the spring and pulled a handful of pebbles from the water. He let them slip through his fingers like he wasn't sure if the sound was real. You don't have to be. It just is. Later, they made camp under the cottonwoods. The sky turned purple behind the hills, and a chill crept in through the brush. Aaliyah wrapped herself tighter and leaned against a tree, watching the flames dance in front of her. Back in town, she said slowly, before you found me, I heard someone say they were going to sell me off if no one came by sunrise. Silas didn't flinch. He just added another piece of dry wood to the fire. I figured. They don't tie someone up like that without planning something worse. She looked down at her hands, fists clenched around her knees. What would have happened if you were half a day later? You don't need to think about that now, he said. I do. He paused, then met her eyes. Then here's the answer. You wouldn't be here. She let that settle. The cold truth of it. The honesty of it. Silas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded cloth. He handed it to her. Clean linen wrapped around something small. What's this? She asked. Knife, he said. Not a fancy one, but sharp. Keep it close. Don't ask me to rescue you twice. She unwrapped the blade, felt its weight in her hand. The metal was plain, the handle worn, but it was real. It meant something. You think someone's coming? She asked. He looked toward the darkness beyond the trees. No one comes for people like us. But that doesn't mean they won't come looking for trouble. Aaliyah tucked the knife into the fold of her blanket, near her hip. Before sleep, she whispered, I'm not running. I know, Silas said, without turning his head. That's why you're still alive. That night, she dreamed of fire and rope and the cold post beneath her back. But when she woke, it was just stars above her, the fire still glowing low, and a man sitting a few feet away, not speaking but watching. Always watching. And for the first time in a long time, she felt less like prey, more like something learning to stand again. The wind had changed direction again. It blew in from the east now, sharper, colder, bringing with it the faint smell of smoke. Not fire, not fresh, but something old like charred timber or long-dead brush. Silas noticed it first as he packed their gear. He stood still for a moment, staring across the valley with narrowed eyes, then adjusted the strap on his saddlebag without saying anything. Aaliyah caught the look, but waited. They had stayed one more night by the spring. The water had given Aaliyah strength, and for the first time in days, her body didn't ache with every movement. She walked without stumbling. She held the knife Silas had given her like it meant something personal, not just practical. As they rode out, Aaliyah finally asked the question she'd been holding since the night before. You said there's a Lakota encampment out east. Used to be, Silas said. They don't stay long in one place anymore. They move when the soldiers push in. Have you stayed with them before? He hesitated. Once. Few years back. Traded supplies for shelter. You trust them? I trust what they stand to lose, he said. And that makes them careful. They didn't speak again until the sun climbed high. The road east wasn't much of a road, just trampled grass and an occasional fence, post broken at the base. By late morning, they passed a burned-out stagecoach tilted into a ditch. No bodies, no sign of a fight, just the skeleton of the wreck. Silas dismounted and walked a slow circle around the frame. Aaliyah stayed on the horse, watching him. Whoever did this, they were organized, he muttered. Everything useful's gone. Will snapped clean. Bandits? He nodded. Or scouts. Could be from across the border. Or maybe just locals who got tired of being hungry. He pulled something from the ground. A scrap of blue cloth, torn at the edge. He tucked it into his coat without comment. As they rode on, Aaliyah felt the silence growing heavier again. There was something else pressing against her thoughts now. Something deeper. She still didn't know what Silas wanted from all this. And she still didn't know what she wanted, either. They stopped near a rise in the land. Flat rocks scattered around an old cattle marker carved into the hillside. There, Silas finally spoke. You ever kill anyone? Aaliyah looked over at him, surprised by the directness. No. He nodded slowly. Good. Don't make a goal. You? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Yes. The word landed heavy between them. She looked away. Did they deserve it? Some did, he said. Some didn't. Doesn't make much difference when you see them later in your head. It was the most personal thing he'd said since they met. Aaliyah didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound false. Later that day, they came upon a narrow creek running through a cluster of dead pines. The water was shallow, barely more than a trickle, but it was enough. As they knelt beside it, Aaliyah caught sight of hoof prints in the mud, deep and clustered, too many to belong to a wild herd. Fresh, she asked. Silas crouched, pressing his palm near the indent. Half a day, maybe less. Pursuers? Could be. She tightened her grip on the knife under her coat. The idea that someone might still be tracking her hadn't left her since the gallows, but it felt more real now. Silas stood and scanned the horizon. We won't outrun them if they're on horses. So we hide. No, he said. We make it clear we're not worth the effort. That night, they made camp under low-hanging branches in a ravine, shielded from the open land. Silas kept the fire small and used rocks to reflect the heat. He sat close, rifle across his lap, cleaning the chamber slowly. Aaliyah sat opposite, sharpening her knife, the one he gave her, moving the blade slowly across the whetstone he had handed her without a word. She had never owned a weapon before. Now, she was memorizing the feel of it. Silas, she said, not looking up, when you found me, was it really just a coincidence? He looked over at her. I'd heard your name before. Heard it again in town. Colburn. I remembered it. She set the knife down. For my father's case? He nodded. Didn't know you were his daughter at first. Just figure it wasn't right, what they were doing. When I saw it was you, I remembered more. What did you hear about him? Silas exhaled slowly. He stood up to some people who didn't like to be stood up to. Didn't mean he was innocent. Just meant he didn't fold. My father wasn't a good man, she said quietly. But he wasn't the monster they painted him as. Silas nodded once. No one's ever just one thing. That night, before sleep took them, Aaliyah asked one last question. Is this going anywhere? Us? This trail? He didn't answer for a long time. Then finally, he said, I don't know, but for the first time in years, I'm not looking to leave the person next to me behind. She didn't say anything to that, but when she lay down, she shifted closer to the fire. And for the first time since her arrest, she didn't feel like someone waiting to be hunted. She felt like someone choosing to keep moving forward. By the time morning light pushed its way over the rim of the ravine, Silas was already standing, boots planted firm on the rocky slope, scanning the horizon through narrowed eyes. His rifle rested loosely in his hands, but his posture said he didn't expect peace. He hadn't spoken yet, and Aaliyah didn't press him. She sat nearby, brushing her fingers through her tangled hair, trying to get the dirt and sleep out of her eyes. The night had been quiet, but sleep hadn't come easy. She'd listened to the sounds of the dark too long to believe silence always meant safety. When she stood, she moved slower than usual, favoring one leg. The cold had made her knee lock up again. Silas noticed. He didn't comment, just passed her a canteen and nodded toward the narrow trail climbing out of the ravine. They moved with purpose now, more alert, more deliberate. The tracks they'd seen near the creek weren't fading. If anything, there were more now. Silas found them just after midday, a second set, newer, smaller hooves, light riders. He crouched and stared at the ground for a long while. Scouts, he muttered. 2, maybe 3, probably checking ahead. You think they're after us? They're looking for someone. Might be us, might not. Doesn't matter. Aaliyah folded her arms. If they're not, then why does it matter? Silas straightened. Because it means this area isn't quiet anymore. Could be someone's chasing a bounty. Could be militia. Could be worse. That word, worse, hung in the air. They turned west, cutting through terrain that offered more cover. Low rises, rocky brush, trees spaced far enough to weave through without being seen from too far off. But it was slow going. By late afternoon, they hadn't made more than 8 miles. They found shelter under the collapsed roof of an old stone way station. Half the walls had crumbled, but one side still held, leaning into a hill. Silas checked the perimeter, then laid his rifle across the top stones and nodded. "This'll do for tonight." As Aaliyah unpacked what little gear they had, she finally voiced something she'd been holding back. "Why don't you ever talk about what you're running from?" Silas sat down across from her, legs out, leaning against the wall. "Because it won't help you," he said, "and because saying it out loud don't make it any less true. But it makes it real." He looked at her, jaw tight. "It was real before you met me." She didn't look away. "So what happened?" He ran a hand over his face. Then, for the first time since she'd met him, he started talking without looking for an out. "There was a family," he said. "Mine. Wife. Daughter. Lived up near the border. Quiet place. Winters were hard, but the land was honest." Aaliyah didn't speak. She just listened. "One winter, a group of men came through, soldiers, but not from any uniform I recognized. Said they were looking for insurgents. Claimed my neighbor was hiding them. They burned 3 homes. Mine was one of them. I wasn't there. I was up the ridge, hunting mule deer. When I came back, it was just ash." He closed his eyes for a moment, went into town, told the sheriff. He wouldn't even write it down. Said these things happen. Aaliyah's voice was quiet. "What did you do?" "I found the men," Silas said. "Tracked them across 2 counties. Took me 6 days. I didn't let them go." She breathed out slowly. "That why you don't settle down again?" He nodded once. "I know what I'm capable of now, and I know what happens when someone takes too much from you. You become something else." For a while, they just sat. The sun dropped lower, painting the ruined walls in gold and dust. Eventually, she asked, "Do you ever wish you hadn't done it?" He didn't hesitate. "No." "Do you think that makes you a bad man?" Silas finally looked at her again. "I don't think about whether I'm good or bad. I think about whether I can keep going." She nodded slowly, taking it in. "That's what I've been doing too." They shared what little food they had, hardtack and jerky, and watched the light fade from the sky. When night fell, Silas moved a few stones into place to block the wind. Aaliyah laid her blanket down and sat with the knife across her lap. "There's something I haven't told you," she said after a long silence. He glanced over. "I figured. The night I got arrested, there was someone else at the stables. A boy, young, saw the same thing I did. But when they started accusing me, he ran. I think he thought they'd hang him too. You remember his name?" She shook her head. "Just his face. If he shows up again, I'll say what I should have said then. That he didn't do anything. That I didn't either." Silas nodded. "You'll get the chance." "How can you be so sure?" He stood and took his rifle again, leaning it against the far wall. "Because you're still alive. And people who are still alive tend to find their moment, one way or another." She lay back, eyes on the ceiling. The cracked stone above her looked like it might fall in with the next strong wind. But for now it held. And so did she. They were no longer just running. By the 7th day, the pace had changed. Silas moved more cautiously now, not slow, but deliberate, like a man walking toward something he couldn't yet see but knew was coming. Aaliyah noticed the shift. He checked his surroundings more often, rode farther ahead before circling back. Every broken branch, every distant crow's call pulled his gaze. Something had changed, and he hadn't said it yet, but she felt it too. They rode west that morning through a narrow pass, where the trail dipped between 2 jagged ridgelines. The air was cooler, shadowed. At the highest point, Silas stopped and pulled out a spyglass from his coat. He scanned the open basin ahead. Then he handed it to her. "Look just past that tree line," he said. She brought the glass up and narrowed her eyes. Movement. A group of horses. 5, maybe 6. Men in dust-covered coats, some with long rifles slung across their backs. They weren't moving fast, but they were cutting directly toward the pass. She lowered the spyglass. "They're following us." Silas nodded. "Been watching them since yesterday. They stayed wide, kept low. Bounty hunters, maybe, or worse." "Worse like what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he moved off the trail and down into the tree line, dismounting in a quiet rhythm that Aaliyah matched. They tied the horse and began walking west through the undergrowth. After an hour of moving in silence, she finally spoke. Why keep going? Why not just face them? He stopped, looked at her. Because if they're after me, I'll deal with them. But if they're after you, she held his gaze. Then we deal with it together. Something in his face softened, just a flicker. Then it was gone. They pressed on until late afternoon, when the trees thinned out and the hills sloped downward into a wide patch of dry valley. In the middle of it sat a small Lakota encampment, 7 tents arranged in a loose circle, smoke rising from 2 low fires. A few horses were tied out beyond the camp perimeter. Children ran barefoot near the cooking stones. The moment Silas stepped forward, a young man on horseback broke from the circle and rode toward them fast. Aaliyah tensed, but Silas raised one hand calmly. The rider slowed, circling them once, then reined in. He looked younger than Aaliyah had expected, no older than 20, his hair tied back, his eyes sharp and cautious. "You speak the language?" he asked in firm English. "Enough," Silas answered. "I came through here 5 years ago, looking for medicine woman Harja. She was kind to me once." The rider looked them both over. "Harja is dead," he said, "but her daughter lives. Stay here." He turned the horse and rode back. Aaliyah turned to Silas. "You didn't say you knew anyone here." "I didn't know if they'd still be here," he replied. "Didn't want to promise anything I couldn't keep." Minutes later, another rider approached, an older woman in a green shawl, her face lined by time but not weariness. She dismounted and came straight to Silas. "I remember you," she said. "You gave my mother the skin of a deer in winter." Silas nodded. "And she gave me bread when I hadn't eaten in 4 days." The woman looked at Aaliyah. "You come in peace?" Aaliyah nodded. "We just need a place to stop for a night. We're not looking to stay." "You will eat," she said firmly. "Then we will talk." That night, they were given space near the outer fire. A boy brought them stew in a cracked clay bowl and water in a skin flask. No one questioned them, but many looked, especially at Silas, as though they remembered something from long ago and didn't know how to place it. After the meal, the woman returned. She sat near the fire and folded her hands. "There are men riding behind you," she said calmly. 6, maybe more. They asked about a man with a rifle and a girl with a scarred wrist. Aaliyah instinctively covered her arm with her sleeve. "We didn't give them answers," the woman added, "but they are not far." Silas stared into the fire. "We'll move at first light." The woman studied him. "You came here once with nothing. Now you have someone beside you. That means something." He didn't reply. Later, as the fire burned lower, Aaliyah sat beside him. "Do you think it's the law?" Silas shook his head. "Too quiet. Too careful. The law doesn't sneak." "Then who?" "I think it's someone who knows me. Or thinks they do." She leaned closer. "What do we do?" "We sleep. Then we ride. And if they catch us—" She interrupted. "Then we stand." He looked at her. "You ready for that?" "I've been ready since you cut me down." The fire cracked beside them, and for the first time, Silas rested his hand on hers. Not a gesture of affection, but something steadier. A confirmation. They were no longer running for the same reasons, but they would fight on the same side. They left the Lakota camp just before dawn, riding into a pale gray light with the cold biting at their faces and the silence between them filled only by the sound of hooves over hard-packed soil. The woman who'd spoken with them the night before, Harja's daughter, had offered them supplies, dried meat, a flask of pine sal for cuts, and a single sentence spoken in quiet warning as they mounted their horse. "They will come before nightfall." Silas had nodded. That was enough. They moved quickly through the lower ridge, following an old trapper's path that curved west along a dry riverbed. It wasn't the fastest route, but it was the kind that allowed them to see trouble coming before it arrived. Silas stayed ahead, eyes scanning high ground, one hand near his revolver, the other loose on the reins. Aaliyah sat steady behind him, arms wrapped around his coat. She didn't speak, and neither did he. Not until they reached the split in the path. "This is where we decide," he said finally, pulling the horse to a stop near a thick patch of brush. Aaliyah looked ahead, breathing heavy. "Decide what? Keep running, or set the ground ourselves?" She swallowed, feeling the tension rise in her chest. "You think they'll follow us either way?" Silas nodded. They're not paid to give up. Aaliyah stared down the path. Dust shifted in the distance. She saw no movement, but she felt it now, inevitable like a clock winding down. We make a stand, she said. Silas didn't argue. They set up camp at the base of a stone outcropping, using the ridge as cover on three sides. There was a narrow funnel of land, just wide enough for a horse to pass through. If their pursuers came, they'd have no choice but to pass through that choke point. Silas handed her the rifle. You remember how I showed you? Yes. If you fire, you don't hesitate. Aim center. Don't try to wound. Aaliyah nodded, gripping the weapon with both hands. You're not buying time for me, he added. You're buying time for us. The sun rose higher, and with it, the silence stretched. They didn't speak much. They checked their weapons. They ate sparingly. They made sure the horse was tied off where it couldn't be easily spotted. Then they waited. By late afternoon, dust rose on the edge of the ridge. Riders. Aaliyah counted 6, just as the woman had said. They came slow, scanning both sides, rifles slung casually, but hands too close to the triggers to be anything but ready. They don't know we're watching, Silas said quietly, crouched beside her. Not yet. Who are they really? She asked. Do you know? He took a breath. I recognize. Ex-militia. Used to work out of Galisteo. Back then, they were called enforcers. Now, they call themselves contractors. Same men who burned out a village 10 years ago when someone couldn't pay his debt. They were the ones? She asked, her voice dry. He nodded. Same uniforms. Same horses. I didn't think they'd remember me. I was wrong. Aaliyah's fingers tightened around the stock. Then we end this. The first shot rang out from Silas's rifle, echoing across the valley. One rider dropped immediately, falling sideways from his saddle, unmoving. The others ducked, scattered. The ambush was sprung. Silas moved fast, shifting position. Aaliyah stayed steady, breath in her throat, then squeezed the trigger. Her first shot missed. The second didn't. The man she hit spun back, dropping behind a bush. She didn't see where the bullet landed, but she saw him stop moving. They didn't panic. That's what Silas had told her. If they're real hunters, they won't scatter. They'll test your patience. Flank. Wait. Break your rhythm. And that's what they did. 2. Try to climb the ridge on the left. Silas caught the first one before he reached cover, then turned and took a shot that clipped the other's leg. He tumbled backward, groaning. One remained, crouched behind a dead log, using the terrain. Then, everything went quiet again. Silas stayed low. His rifle empty now, he switched to his revolver. Aaliyah held the rifle tight, scanning. Last one will wait, he whispered. He's not a fool. Then how do we get him to move? He thinks we've got no more bullets. He stood slowly. Silas. He raised both hands, stepping out from behind cover. The last rider rose from the brush, rifle raised. You should have stayed buried, Cade, the man shouted. Silas didn't speak. Aaliyah watched it unfold, every second stretched tight. The rider stepped closer, aiming dead center. That's when Aaliyah fired. Her third shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Silas drew and fired once. Clean. Quick. And then it was over. The canyon fell silent again. Silas walked over to the body, checked his pockets, then took the rifle and ammunition. When he returned, he looked at her carefully. You did good. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off. She sat down hard on the dirt. I didn't think I could. You could, he said. And you did. They buried the bodies shallowly. Silas said it was better than leaving them for the buzzards. Aaliyah didn't argue. That night, they made camp again, this time without fear of footsteps in the dark. As the fire burned low, Aaliyah looked across at him. Are we safe now? He shook his head. No, but we're not being hunted anymore. And tomorrow, he met her eyes. We ride towards something, not away from it. She nodded. This wasn't the end, but it was the first time they'd stood their ground. And it changed everything. The morning after the shootout brought no celebration, only stillness. The kind of silence that comes after something final has passed through a place. The fire had burned low overnight, and the air carried the clean, cold breath of desert dawn. Aaliyah stirred first. She sat up slowly, her back stiff from the rocky ground, and looked towards Silas. He hadn't slept. He sat against a tree, eyes open, rifle across his lap. Not tense, just watching. "We're not safe here," he said, voice low. "I thought they were the last." "They were," he answered. "But word travels. You kill men like that, someone hears about it." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and nodded. "Then we keep moving." Silas stood and began gathering the gear. He moved slower than usual. There was a stiffness in his right leg. She hadn't seen it before, but it was there now. The price of being older than the fight. She walked over, reached for one of the saddlebags. "Let me do it," she said. He didn't argue. As they rode out, they didn't speak for over an hour. The trail curved west through open land now. Nothing but scrub brush and endless low hills. No more shelter. No more hiding. And Aaliyah noticed something else. They weren't scanning for threats the same way anymore. They weren't riding like prey. At midday, they came upon a ruined cabin near a dry riverbed. Half the roof was gone, the walls held up by luck. But there was something different about this place. A kind of hush, not danger, just history. Silas dismounted and walked around the side. Aaliyah followed him to the front steps. There, nailed to the doorframe, hung a rusted iron horseshoe. He stared at it for a long while. Said nothing. Aaliyah finally asked, "You know this place?" Silas didn't move. "It belonged to someone I knew. Long time ago. Someone who helped you?" He nodded once. "When I came back from the border, I had nothing left. He let me stay here. Gave me work. Let me breathe." "What happened to him?" Silas looked down. He stayed too long in a land that didn't forgive kindness. Aaliyah stepped inside first. The place was dusty, floor warped. A broken chair collapsed near the hearth. But there was still something whole about it. She turned slowly, taking it in. "We could fix it," she said. He looked up. "Fix what?" "This place. The roof. The walls. There's still water in the well. You said it once. You're tired of running." He watched her. For once, there was no guarded silence in his face. Just thought. Honest consideration. "I'm not a man people forget, Aaliyah. And I'm not a girl they forgive," she said plainly. "We've both done things. We both carry names. But you gave me the choice to walk away from mine. Let me do the same for you." Outside, the wind picked up. Loose dust rolled across the porch like a warning. Silas walked out and sat on the steps. Aaliyah followed, kneeling beside him. "I don't know what comes next," she said, "but I want to choose it. I want it to be something I made, not something I was dragged into." He looked at her. "You really think we can build something here?" "I think we already started," she said quietly. "The moment we stopped running." He stayed quiet a long time. Then, finally, he stood and walked around to the shed behind the house. The door creaked open. Inside, leaning against the far wall, was a shovel. Old but strong. He picked it up. Came back. "There's a wellhead," he said, nodding to the dry patch 50 yards off. "We start there." They spent the rest of the afternoon digging, clearing out collapsed beams, pulling up roots. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy, but it was the first thing they'd done without fear. That night, they lit a fire in the broken hearth. Aaliyah sat on the floor, warming her hands, her face flushed with sweat and dirt. Silas crouched beside the fire, coat off, sleeves rolled up, hands scratched from labor. "You never told me your daughter's name," Aaliyah said gently. He looked into the flames. "Clara," he said. "She was 6. Aaliyah nodded, not pressing more. "She'd have liked this place," he added. "I think she still would." They sat in silence for a while. Then Aaliyah spoke again. "You saved me once, and I followed you because I didn't have a better option. But this place, this could be something we both build. Not out of guilt, not out of fear, but out of choice." He met her eyes, and for the first time, he smiled. Not a full smile, just a faint one. But it was real. Tomorrow, there'd be more work. But for tonight, they had a roof over their heads. And maybe, finally, a place to stay. The days that followed passed, not in silence, but in labor. Mornings began with the sun warming the cracked boards of the cabin walls, and nights ended by the fire, the light casting shadows over fresh planks and repaired stone. The rhythm of work brought a different kind of exhaustion. Not survival, not escape, just effort, progress. Silas and Aaliyah didn't talk much during the day, but when they did, it wasn't about the past. It was about what needed fixing: the slanted roofline, the collapsed floor joists, how many boards they could salvage from the broken fence. Silas had scavenged an old hammer from the shed and fashioned nails from scrap. Aaliyah had cleared the hearth, lined it with rock, and for the first time in years, cooked over steady fire rather than open flames under a sky that never offered shelter. On the fifth day, they found a name carved into the underside of a shelf: Beckett. Silas ran his hand over the worn initials. "He was the one who helped you?" Aaliyah asked. Silas nodded. He didn't have much, but he shared it anyway. She looked around the cabin, now no longer just ruin. Then maybe this place carries something worth keeping. Silas didn't say it, but he felt it. The shift. The sense that they weren't surviving anymore. They were staying. One morning, while reinforcing the cabin's doorframe, Silas noticed something on the horizon. Two riders, far off, moving slow, not in pursuit. He tensed. Aaliyah came up behind him. "Trouble?" He watched them for a moment, then shook his head. "Doesn't look like it." As the figures approached, it became clear. A man and a boy, both thin, both tired. The man held up one hand as they neared, and Silas returned the gesture. They weren't lawmen. They weren't bounty hunters. Just wanderers. Aaliyah stepped outside. "You know them?" she asked. "No, but I know what it's like to be on the trail with no place to land." The two were offered water, then shade. A few shared words. The man, Jude, had been moving west in spring, the boy his nephew. They didn't ask for more than rest. Silas nodded toward the creek bed and said they could pitch camp near the cottonwoods. When the sun dropped that night, Aaliyah sat with Silas near the fire. "We're not the only ones trying to outrun something," she said. "No," he agreed. "But most folks don't want to be reminded of what they left behind." "You do." "I don't want to forget it either," he said. "That's how we ended up in that place to begin with. People forgetting too fast." She turned the knife in her hand slowly. The same one he had given her weeks ago, still sharp, still used. "You ever think about going back? To the towns, the people who still carry your name?" "I used to," he said. "Not anymore." "Because you think it won't matter?" "Because I think it matters more here." She looked around them. The rebuilt porch. The fence she'd helped restand. The lantern hanging from the doorway. All of it imperfect, but there's... Aaliyah's voice was quiet. "You know, I think if I had been left on that post one more day, I wouldn't have made it." "I know," he said. "You never asked me if I wanted to live. You didn't need to say it. It was in your eyes." She looked at him now, not as the man who'd cut her down, not as the gunfighter from the stories the town had whispered about, but as someone who had given her a choice and stayed long enough to see her use it. "I'm not leaving," she said. Silas didn't blink. "I know." He stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked out over the ridge where stars had begun to appear. "There's peace in not being known," he said, "but there's a different kind of peace in being known by the right person." She walked to stand beside him. Then maybe that's all we ever needed. The sound of crickets carried across the dark. The wind blew soft through the grass, and the cabin creaked gently behind them, not from weakness, but from life. They didn't speak again that night. There was nothing left to run from, nothing left to confess. In a land that never promised them anything, they had found something no one could give and no one could take. They had found home.